Okay, so it says we're going live and it looks like we're live now. How's it going, Jordan?
It's going well. It's been a very nice day.
Good. So I'll say up top here that there's a bit of delay between the Zoom call and then the YouTube chat. So I'm not going to be able to engage with people. Like, if people have questions, let's just save them for a little bit of time at the end. And I'll check those when we get to that place.
Yeah, maybe we
So
can periodically take a pause and see if anything fits
yeah,
up.
for sure. Okay, I like that idea. Okay, cool. So maybe I can just say a little bit about the impetus for this idea. Um, Sorry, the YouTube screen just popped up and I was hearing two voices. Okay, so the reason for this conversation was I was interested in double clicking on one of the really important pieces of the idea of cultivating sovereignty, and that's relationship to money and wealth. And I've been learning more about wealth creation. I haven't been interested in it before. I come from a performing arts background, and it's just like I've never felt like it was my ball game. So I never really paid much attention to it until very recently. And one of my ways in was hearing people in this particular space, game B, sort of system thinking space. A lot of what the thinkers had in common was some success in some entrepreneurial activity or venture that led to wealth. And from an outsider's perspective, seeing what your experience has been, Jordan, is somebody who invested a lot of front end energy into creating freedom for yourself. The only reason you've been able to do like the deep thinking and sort of deep sea diving into this game B space is because you had the freedom to do it. You didn't have to you didn't have to clock in at a 9-to-5 job. So as we're talking about game B and transition B, like what do new business ventures look like in this new space where people are thinking about what's coming next? And a crucial piece just feels like be in right relationship with money. And we had a pre-call yesterday, and one of the things which I think is a good place to start is you made a distinction between wealth and prosperity.
Mm-hmm.
Do you remember that at the top of the conversation?
Yeah.
Does that feel like a good place to dive in?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's just, I was also thinking about our call yesterday, and some notions in that area came up for me. So maybe we can weave it together. And another concept that came up for me that felt very closely connected was just a more basic notion called choice making.
Uh-huh.
And one of the ways that we can look at the notion of money is that money at the end of the day is a proxy for choice making. And so if I'm paying you, if you're my employee, one of the things that is part of that relationship is that I'm giving you money and you're giving me your choices, meaning I get to tell you what to do to some extent, right?
Mm-hmm.
And to a greater or lesser extent, depending on the nature of the relationship. And I think that's a really nice way to begin to walk into at least one aspect of the question. Mm-hmm. So this question, this distinction between wealth and prosperity, came up when you were talking about your own experience of having a story, of the inevitable corrupting characteristics of wealth.
Yeah,
to have money and to have made money differently, both involve different levels of unreasonable or inappropriate corruption. Mm-hmm. And I talked about this distinction between wealth and prosperity, which I mentioned, by the way, we could just use those as two terms. Like, I don't want to anchor on either one of those. Neither of those terms has a long etymological lineage that I'd like to sort of point out as being more right than the other. I'm just saying there's two ways of looking at it. Mm-hmm. And saying that there's something about one direction or one origin or one disposition or basis of approach that we can call wealth, or on the left-hand side, that tends to be more closely associated with both personal corruption, things that are reducing your sovereignty, and external corruption, things that are actually reducing other people's sovereignty, making actions in the world that reduce other people's sovereignty. And we might say that at the center of that is choices on the basis of fear. And then we talked about the notion of prosperity, which has the characteristic of increasing your sovereignty, and also synergistically, as you make choices out in the world, tends to increase other people's sovereignty. And we might say that's on the basis of love. And if those of you who are familiar with Forrest Landry's work, I'm clearly referencing that in some way, although my level of mastery of his work is nowhere near high enough to say that I'm sourcing from it. But the distinctions that I'm making are clearly echoing what he's written about in his book, The Effective Choice and the Ethics. So I'll give you some examples that I thought of over the past few days. And this is one landed this morning that I thought was quite interesting. And this is in terms of just having wealth. So let's not right now just talk about how you get wealth, but just the act of having it. So just a pile of money lands on your lap, magic. And I think this is actually quite interesting. So what that is to say is that a pile of choice making, a pile of the capacity to have your will, what you want to be the case, has just shifted in the world. Like, you now have much more ability to influence the nature of choice in the world than you did before. And one of the questions is how much. And I've actually had this conversation with a number of people, and there actually seems to be a converging notion that, one, there needs to be a symmetry between your sovereignty and your choice-making capacity. So as you have more, let's say, wisdom as an aspect of sovereignty, as you have more capacity to make choice, as more and more people are looking to you to be making choices either on their behalf or with their consent or assent, you need to have more wisdom to be able to carry that amount of choice. So that's one piece, like there's that notion of symmetry and being very mindful of it. But then we had this interesting artifact that, because of the nature of money in many ways certainly decouples those two. You can have money without having wisdom. And in many ways, in fact, goes the opposite. The less wisdom you have, maybe the more possibility of money you might have. But then there's this other really interesting thing, which is, it is fair to say, I've had a number of conversations with quite thoughtful people, that no human can have enough wisdom to be able to make effective choices beyond about $100 million. So if you have more than $100 million, you're not making effective choices. It's just impossible. Like, if you have $1 billion, you're actually making ineffective choices. No matter how wise and sovereign you are, there's just way too much asymmetry. Like, if you think about how much choice making embodied in money, so how much wealth the average person has, the average American has, whatever, $50,000 worth of net worth, maybe less, I don't know. There's a lot of debt going around. And the average human probably has, close to $1, right? So, or maybe less again. So let's just say it's $1 per person on the planet, and you happen to have $1 billion. Well, in some sense, what that says is that you have to have at least 1 billion times as much wisdom to be able to have enough wisdom to carry that amount of choice-making capacity. And that ain't going to happen. And presumably 100 million is also a pretty high standard. Like, that seems also pretty darn impossible. But as an interesting kind of heuristic, it seems that it's plausible. Like, it really does seem like a reasonable proposition to say, in terms of creating wealth, in terms of having wealth, and then creating wealth and having wealth, once you've made about $10 million, you're beginning to get into a zone where you're increasingly likely to be having more choice-making capacity than you can actually deploy with wisdom, to make effective choices with that. And if you've blown past 100 million, you have almost certainly put yourself in a place where you're just going to be making more trouble, more bad than good. Kind of an odd heuristic. Like, it's a funny thing to say. And I remember when I first got into the entrepreneurship game, like when I was first getting involved in my very first startup, I remember thinking to myself that like $10 million was an insane amount of money. Like, I didn't grow up with any meaningful amount of money. In fact, we were reasonably poor for a sizable fraction, although not all of it. And I remember being like, if somebody came to me and said, the way this is going to work out is you're going to do X, and at the end of X, you're going to have $10 million. I would have gone like, yes, done, signed. Like, we're going to cap And if they'd come and said, look, here's the deal. You get to work, and it's going to be hard, like a low likelihood of success, hard work, and we're going to cap. You can make no more than $100 million. I would have just sort of laughed at them. Like, what? You basically just threw a magic number at me. These aren't real numbers. That's not a real thing. And I'm saying that maybe that's actually a really good idea. Like, as an individual, if you're going into entrepreneurship, if you're going into the startup gig, for example, if you're really trying to go hard in the direction of moving a whole bunch of game age chips from other people to yourself, which is what's happening, right? You're taking choice making away from some people and giving it to yourself. If you've done something where $10 million has accrued to your side of the balance sheet, that's the point at which taking your foot off the accelerator is an increasingly wise choice. And you probably shouldn't be making a whole lot more than like 30, 40, unless it's just luck. Like, you just did something where it's just going to kind of have some number. And if you've made more than 100, you've probably actually been doing something that has been, call it, too much in the direction of making too much money, and not in the direction of actually making effective choices as a heuristic, right? Now, notably, oddly enough, in some of these conversations, we actually were able to identify certain locations where some of the objectives, the things that were being endeavored, were almost certainly important, like needed to happen. And it seemed to be very much part of the vocation, like the calling of the individual. Let's say Elon Musk and switching the world from oil to electricity. Like, it's probably a really good idea. Like, that seems like that's what's in the path of viable futures, is that shift. And it seems like it's like he's uniquely called to do that. There's something about his very being that seems to be uniquely called to do that. And to the degree to which he is truly fully in service to his calling, and also money is flowing through that seems plausible. But then you look at something like neural lace, and you're like, neural lace feels like it may be something where his choice making is now too high. And that's not his calling, I don't think. It feels very much like he's doing something where he has the ability to make it happen in the world, but it's not really his to do. And there's an error that's beginning to emerge on that side. So that kind of becomes the second.
I'm just curious how you pick up on that. Like the making that distinction between, this might not be his calling, is because he's clearly put so much energy into other things already. That this is just like tacking another thing on.
If I listen to the thought process that goes into neural lace, he's basically reverse engineering. He's working backwards from a story that he doesn't really have a solid grounding in. Like, he's kind of downward interpolating, saying, wow, it looks like the AI story and the singularity story is really big and real and dangerous. And my heuristics are telling me that the only viable path is one where man and machine merge. And so we're going to make that happen. But it doesn't feel like it's something that he's embodying all the way down to the bottom. Like, if you were to really go in and start beginning to ask deep questions about the nature of synapses and the nature of consciousness, like these kinds of hard questions that, honestly, if you're going to be promoting human brain augmentation into machines, you should be a master of this field. Like, this should be your fucking life. Like, you shouldn't be even the least bit of a tourist.
You shouldn't give a shit about cars at that point. You should give zero shits about cars.
Yeah, exactly. If that's what you're doing, it should be 100% of your focus. So much so that you can't even distinguish between yourself and it. And that's my point. And that's what I mean by calling. So that kind of branches. So let me stop there. So that was the point of saying, okay, let's talk about choice making and this notion of the symmetry between your sovereignty and the amount of choice making that you're literally able to carry. Like, how much responsibility can you actually take in the world and be quite likely to make effective choices with that responsibility? And the notion that there's almost certainly just an upper limit, that no human being could ever carry more than a certain amount of responsibility, which then shows up as an upper limit of the amount of wealth that you should ever accrue to yourself.
Do you think if someone's really tuned into their calling, they'll have an idea of how much responsibility they should be taking on?
Yeah. And I think this actually has a bunch of different characteristics to it. And you said really, so let me just focus on that word because it has a lot of nuance to it. So one piece is something like, Some people, many people, I think, who are attracted to the story of game B put themselves too much into it. They try to carry more than is theirs to carry. In fact, sometimes just try to carry the whole thing. Oftentimes they're like, I'm the only one. Like they've never met anybody else who's really, really earnestly like sees it and feels it and just is committed to it. And so like, well, I guess fuck it. I guess I'm just going to have to do the whole thing.
Yeah.
And this is, of course, too heavy. It's way too much. No human could possibly carry the whole thing, even vaguely.
Yeah. Can I say something about that?
Sure.
I think a lot of the engagements happening on social media and Twitter, for example, is like where a lot of these sorts of conversations happen. And Twitter definitely selects for a kind of pithiness, like really sort of like if you were good at writing philosophy papers in college and like you have a decent sense of humor when you write, like Twitter's going to select for those sort of ideas or memes that pop up. You know, and I think what you're saying about people feeling like they need to take on more than is theirs, there might be just like a lack of imagination of the laboratories that these sorts of ideas could be played in. Does that make sense?
No, I'm sure it does, but I didn't follow. So it felt like there was a shift that happened there. And there's something in that shift that I didn't perceive.
Okay. I think this is it. Like, because Twitter or social media is like the public square where these ideas are talked about, it seems kind of like it's only one facet of engaging with these ideas. Like there are other places, for example, experiments with collectives, in-person collectives that may not be open sourcing their experiments on the internet.
Or maybe, and we just haven't found them because the internet's a gigantic, mess.
Yeah. So I guess the whole point of what I was saying is people taking on too much. Part of it just feels like for what's selected for in the public square right now. So
maybe let me just say some things back. So let's imagine that there's a really big story. Oh, how fun. Are you familiar with the concept of transmedia?
Transmedia? I can put the two words together, but
well, it's funny because if you use like the transcendent sense, like Kantian transcendence or transcendence, and then you combine that with media and you look at it like, that's an interesting combination, you're definitely in the right zone. But for the moment, I'll just make it a little bit more prosaic and then we pop it back up. But one of the things that we learn in transmedia is that each medium kind of has its thing. So if I'm trying to tell a story, and the story should be told in a comic book because of the nature of the story and the nature of the medium, and I try to tell that story in a movie, I'm doing something wrong. It won't land right. Like the medium just can't carry the characteristics of whatever it is the nature of the particular story rightly. To make it more obvious, like if I'm trying to tell a story that should be told in a painting and I'm trying to tell it in a radio play, that's going to be hard. Right? Like, and you see green and the brush strokes are thick. That just is an obvious, each medium can carry different aspects. What transmedia says is, hey man, there is no story that any one medium can hold. And in fact, all media, and by all media, I mean literally all phenomena in physical reality that can carry signal, must be considered as part of the way that you're expressing the whole story. Like the whole story is a whole story. It's a whole thing. And so Twitter can't carry the whole story. Facebook can't carry the whole story. Money can't carry the whole story. Grass can't carry the whole story. Human beings can't carry the whole story. Like it's the whole field of possibility, the whole field of reality that can carry a story is what we need to be contemplating. And then we need to have a high degree of aesthetic discernment, which is, and I'm using that word now in a slightly new way, which is to actually have a high degree of sensitivity towards what is exactly the right medium or media, like combinations to carry this particular aspect so that the aspect is most fully expressed with the least amount of noise coming from the media that were selected and in by the direction, i.e. the media are not adding and are not subtracting from what is trying to be expressed through those media. So that's something that came to me as a result of what we were talking about.
Wait, say more about aesthetic discernment. Like, say more about the qualities of a person who has that capacity.
This is a super powerful thing. We're, by the way, way off topic, but maybe we'll come back.
No, it's on topic.
Okay, I trust you. I trust you
Okay.
completely. So to me, at least, there's something about I'll bridge two things. We've got, what's it called? Participatory knowing. Oh, fun. Yeah, this is a conversation I was having on Facebook, actually, with a woman who's an artist. So participatory knowing in the Vervaeke sense, what he calls relevance realization, which we might think of as being a diffuse, broad, subtle, and multimodal, meaning all the different ways that your body has of perceiving, way of knowing, and you're directly, like, hand in hand in relationship with reality, and the difference, and you're part of it. Like, the whole point of a participatory knowing is that you are not in third person looking at something and trying to be separate from it and sort of scientifically analyzing it, but you're in it. And there's something about the way that you are of it that gives you a way of sensing what it is that you couldn't possibly sense if you were just looking at it. And then what I want to do is I want to bring in another set of languages, which would be, in fact, from Forrest's work, which he talks about different modes. And here the mode of the quality of feeling. So the difference, say, for example, between a semantics, knowing, propositional, the way Vervaeke would talk about top down from his stack, propositional to participatory. We know in language, the way that we know in language, and the way that our mind is able to process signs and symbols or signals in schema, right, in paradigms that make sense through that modality. Forrest talks about this other one, the qualities of feeling that come from the bottom up, in that sense, like from the ground up through us. And they come in they show up as being very subtle. So if you're sensitive to subtle qualities of feeling, this is how you, for example, I think I've talked about this previously. If you're playing music and you're not playing written music, right? Written music is when you're playing from signs, like you're reading some sign and you're just producing the mechanical thing the signs are telling you to produce. But you're listening to what wants to be expressed in the music, and you're just making yourself increasingly capable of sensing what is the next note that needs to happen, and almost being of service to that next note and becoming more and more transparent. Well, this is what Forrest would call the quality of feeling. And we could have an infinite number of qualities of feeling. We can name feelings, but I could give you, so one feeling might be sadness. Like, that's a pretty common feeling that we can share very easily. But then we've got, like, the quality of feeling of melancholy. Well, okay, that's a little bit more, we've all kind of had melancholy. If I could describe it a little while, interesting, some nuance there. I'm like, yeah, well, let's go with the kind of melancholy of when your kid is going away to college. Like, oh, well, that's an even different flavor, right? You can notice, like, the qualities of the flavor of feeling are in fact actually infinite, because they're directly associated with the infinity of what it is to be experiencing reality, the whole of reality. So when I said aesthetic discernment, I was saying developing skillfulness in the precise of these modalities, the participatory knowing and qualities of feeling, and becoming capable of using those modalities to sense the characteristics of the expression. What is it that wants to be expressed in this transcendent mode before it is expressed, right? If I were to think it at all in any way, see it, smell it, taste it, I'm already embodying it in that medium. So the most subtle, right, the most subtle characteristic of this thing that wants to be expressed, not yet expressed in any way, and then having sensitivity to the characteristics of the ways, the modes of expression, painting or radio, that are most harmonious with the essence of what it is that wants to be expressed, and then to be able to skillfully do so. Right? So that would be aesthetic discernment, would be those three characteristics simultaneously. We might call that an individual who's has that, a master artist or a great artist. Someone like a Picasso who could take the essence of the feeling of Guernica and then could actually modulate into that, into physical expression. But imagine if you had somebody who was sort of like Picasso and Beethoven and was like, Guernica really actually needs to be more in the music domain than in the painting domain. Or the Ninth Symphony needs to actually be painted, not music. But I'm no longer bound to any given medium. I can now express myself through all possible media with that level of mastery. Like, that would be the God mode of that particular skill.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. when you were first talking, I immediately saw its connection to relationship with money. And then I didn't for a while. And then maybe it kind of circled back. So let me take a crack at where I think I want to go. The idea of propositional versus participatory knowing.
Yep.
It feels like stories are constructed based on either or both, sort of those two ways of knowing interacting in some way. And I was reflecting on how stories around money are created, people's sort of relationship to safety, security, like whether or not they deserve abundance. Like there are all of these like codes that can get put in place that might affect one's relationship to money, which is just flow, energy. So let's talk a little bit about where some of those stories come from. And as someone who talks a lot about sovereignty, what are ways of engaging with those stories in a way that feels helpful?
Wow, that's great. So obviously right now, what I'd like to put out there is a caveat, a big caveat, which is to say that we're having this conversation and it's just us. And there are people commenting on it on YouTube, but I have no sense whatsoever that I can vaguely answer the question you're asking in a deeply rich or whole way. All I can do is maybe nudge a little bit in the direction, right? So I will be putting some things out there that make sense to me and feel meaningful. I am quite certain that if this is even a small part, it's only a very small part of that story.
Cool.
And,
nice caveat.
And each person will have their own. Yeah. So some things that come up as we're talking about money, right, is that the struggle is implicit in money. There has been money is wow. So take this as part of the story. And I don't know if this is how true the story is, but there's something to it that's useful. A long time ago, like 100 years ago, and a lot longer, humans routinely had to deal with the problem of scarcity. Like it was just the nature of life. The nature of life was that we're going to go hungry. And in fact, the nature of life was that quite often we'd go a lot hungry, and some of us would die of starvation, depending on where we were in the vicissitudes of nature. In fact, if you think about the origin story of humans, like the way that we currently tell the story in Western science, is that we almost didn't make it as a species. Like we almost died out. And so this notion of how do we actually deal with privation, not just scarcity, but privation, is deeply fundamental. And the notion that we live in a world where it's at least plausible that people no longer need to go hungry is actually a relatively recent idea. You know, up until the middle of the 19th century, it was obvious that some people were going to go without. And some people are going to go without a lot and go without lots of things like food and, you know, warmth in the winter and nice clothes and fill in the blank. And so money exists in at least in some sense, like there's some aspects of it. There's lots of things going on here, but at least in some aspects, in order to answer the question of who's going to go without. Those who have more money don't, and those who have less money do. And then you've got the question of how do you get it? How do we allocate the money? But that's actually really important to recognize that embedded in the underlying fundamental assumption of money is scarcity. And embedded in the psychology of scarcity is in fact privation, of truly being at the edge and maybe on the other side of the edge. And this makes sense. So when you're touching money, like when you're just holding it, you're holding that lineage, you're holding that history, and it cannot help but be felt inside you. You know, the moment that I have money is also the moment where I become aware of the fact that I might not have money. And I think there's even a point in childhood we become aware of this. We become aware of the fact that whatever is coming to you that has so far been coming to you as a nature of family. And your family may or may not have resources, but you don't really know what's the limit. You just know that there's a flow that comes because of relationship. And there's a point at which you become conscious of the fact that there's this other object out there called money that is the thing that has that implication. So then we have all the stories that are built around that, all kinds of stories, right? You've got like class conflict stories. There's a lot, right? For the past several hundred years, we've had formal efforts to shift the way that we resource and allocate privation, and the way that we resource and allocate plenitude, through formal narrative, through manifestos and propaganda, right? Telling stories that weaponize or try to create conflict to shift that. And I'm not, saying that that's a bad thing. I'm just saying that's the thing that's been out there. And a lot of that stuff, like those stories and the mimetic vector of those stories, like they were designed to land, right? They were designed to influence and change behavior. And some of them are told in a very pithy way, and they land aggressively. And by the way, this is true on both sides, right? So one side might tell a story of, you worked really hard, you earned this money, and the money that you have is in fact a sign of your virtue, right? And that's a story, and that story protects your readiness and willingness to make and earn money. And then there's another story that says that merely participating in the system of money makes you as complicit in the exploitation of the billions of people who are absolutely harmed in at least some senses by the global capitalism is another story, right? And that story makes it very difficult to choose to make and earn money. And we should recognize that these are both weapons. Both of these stories are weapons. Right? They are not there for the purposes of upgrading your sovereignty. They are there for the purposes of influencing your choices for the benefit of somebody other than you. And that's important, right? Because neither one of those ultimately is going to end in a good place. And this is, by the way, I think it's very important to hold this, because if you're coming from the lineage that believes the hard work and thrift equals virtue, therefore that story is a story that teaches people how to be good in the world, what I just said offends you, makes you angry. Because I just told you that story is in fact a story that ultimately is not in service of you as the individual who's hearing the story, and by the way, not in service of other people. If you're coming from the lineage of capitalism as an exploitative system that treads on the souls and the bodies of the poor, I just told you that story is also not in the service of you, the poor, or other people. That also is going to make you very offended, right? Nonetheless, I'm putting it out there. That is my proposition, that all ideologies are bad. Ideology is just not the right tool. But that's one piece. One piece of this is that we've been fighting ideological wars now for a couple hundred years. And here's the thing. We've also had embodied experiences as individuals. And all these stories are based on real, actual fucking experiences, right? I've had experiences where I have, aspired to or desired something, and I could not afford it. And the people who could afford it seemed like dicks. There did not seem to be natural virtue flowing to the allocation of what these things are going on. Clearly, this thing is something that should have inured to me, or at least to somebody who I felt was, deeply, deeply virtuous. And the people who were getting it were clearly assholes, right? There's no question about that. I've worked in businesses where the person who was in charge, who drove, like, what was it from the movie Office Space, was a douchebag, right? And they had all kinds of fancy stuff. And so the internal logic of, well, there's something about what's going on in the system and the way that money works and gives people access to making their choices be more influential, that's deeply mismatched with the notion of virtue and the notion of sovereignty and maturity. And I, have worked in circumstances where myself, and my circumstances were never as bad as many, where I felt that all of my time and energy and life and capacity and vitality was being thrown into waste, like absolute waste. And I had no influence over it. Right? That's real. There's no question. That's absolutely real for almost everyone, actually. I would say, in fact, for everyone, but we'll skip that part. But certainly for almost everyone. And in many cases, brutally so. Right? So it's not just my time, but actually literally my life. Like whether I'm a coal miner or I'm, working at, what's a good example of what just flat out kills you? Well, let's just go into the third world where I'm, working in a machine shop or a sweatshop. My life energy, my literal vitality of being alive, the duration that I'll be on this planet and my capacity to have meaningfulness is being completely bled into this machine, over which I have no control. In fact, is massively more powerful than me and cares about me not at all. or even sociopathically. It cares about me only to the degree to which it can do precisely what it's doing. That's true. I mean, that's a true thing. And those experiences are then looking for meaning. They're looking for sense. And so if some stories show up and those stories land, you're like, oh shit, like, oh man, I feel terrible about the fact that my choices, these fucking shoes that I just bought, are actually being, built at the life energy and the joy and the possibility of kids in Pakistan. Now I've got a story. What am I going to do? I can pick some stories that talk about how I'm really justified. And by the way, I can rationalize the fuck out of it, because if they didn't have that job, if they didn't have that, what would they have? They'd be even more impoverished. Or I can pick the other stories and try to tell other stories that support the choices that I find myself having to make. Mm-hmm. And the thing that I'm trying to convey is all of that is actually getting in between you and truly being a sovereign being in the world, and your capacity to make effective choices in the direction of increasingly supporting the sovereignty of other people ongoingly. And that's which we say was ethics. So that's the proposition that I would put out there as almost first order for any choice that you're making. And in the context of what we're talking about here, at least ostensibly, of entrepreneurship or wealth creation, same thing, right? If you are being guided by memes, if you're being guided by malware, by narratives that have been constructed by other people for their own purposes, then you're being separated from your capacity to make the most effective choices that you could make.
Yeah, it seems like what's required is a disciplined practice in perceiving what is, rather than overlaying it with, because overlaying something with a meaning or a story happens unconsciously all the fucking time. And you think you're observing reality as it is, and what you're actually doing is there's some story that's in there that maybe you developed as a kid to fucking survive in the world, and it's still running your programming, and you could just accept that as reality. So like, is it turtles all the way down to really seeing reality truly as it is?
No, it's the exact opposite, actually. So it's turtles all the way down if you're trying to run it from the top of the stack. If you're trying to run it through propositional knowing, it's turtles all the way down, which is to say that it's kind of a paradox, because you'll never get there. If you're doing it through the bottom up, or from the ground up through participatory knowing, you're already there. In fact, you're always already there. There's nothing separating you but yourself.
Nice.
And there was a point when you were a kid before that story was in your head. And guess what? Before it was in your head, it wasn't. And you were directly in relationship with what is. You may not have been in relationship with what is with aesthetic discernment. You may have had a lack of skillfulness in how to be able to sense the possibility of what is presented, and have a skillfulness in your own way to respond to it, to be able to further choices in that context. Now, that's a different thing. But your capacity to be in relationship with what is unmediated by narrative, mediated by ideology, is fundamental. It's primordial. It's the base case. And so you can always go there. Well, you can always kind of reset to that. It's not trivial, but it can be done.
This is making me think of something you brought up in some thread on Twitter, where people were talking about game B principles, and then this sort of meme of transition B came up as like, transition B is where exploratory actions can sort of take place in a transitional period between game A, game B. Sort of makes sense conceptually. And one of the things that you were talking about was feeling drawn to high leverage spaces and collaborating with people on projects that could be hugely influential in the future, and actually are currently, and feeling like, I don't remember exactly how you phrased it, but immature boys was like one of the phrases that came up.
Which I'm included. So I'm not.
Oh, okay.
I am an immature boy.
Okay, great. Okay.
Less so day by day, but nonetheless, still vastly too much.
Yeah. Can you talk about what you meant by that? Unpack that idea a little more.
Yeah, but can I just hold me to that and bring me back to it? But there was something in what you were saying that I wanted to pop out, because it felt like it was pretty important. Yeah, that's right. Because so the branch that brought us here was the notion of I conveyed that my own personal orientation tended to be towards these kinds of high leverage projects.
Right.
Okay.
Yep.
And what I wanted to highlight was that my sense is that the right choice for a given individual, say for example yourself, has to be coming from your particularity, from your singularity as a being in the world. So what is the right choice for me isn't necessarily, or even in any meaningful way, connected to the right choice for you. It may be that your vocation, your way of simultaneously creating wealth, and to some extent you have to, right? You have to eat, and also of being most fully in service to gain B, that thing which we yearned to actually have come into the world, is local to you. Right? So there's very little that I can say about my own personal experience that should be considered as a guide of like best practices. That's not it. To the degree to which you're able to get a sense of me and how mindness shows up and why I end up going in this direction. And then you can say, well, okay, well, now the inquiry is, now who am I? And how does my mindness show up? Like if it turns out that your particular vocation most closely aligns to wealth creation in game A of running a B&B, then do that. Like that is perfect. If it's growing your own food, do that. If it's running a hedge fund, okay, give it a shot. Like it's going to have to be again an aesthetic discernment. Like get a sense, and increasingly become sophisticated in being able to actually use that sense to guide your choices about who you are and what it is about your thrownness into the world that seems to lead to where you particularly should be playing. Like what it is your piece of the puzzle to be holding that you're uniquely qualified to hold. Right. So that's just want to make sure that was out there.
Mm-hmm.
So then in my experience, and I think there's a convergent region for why the sort of low EQ or hampered EQ males tend to be the ones that I was running into. And that's because developmentally, an orientation towards very rapid, like high IQ, rapid turning of gears in strategy space, meaning in the objective movement of objective forces to achieve desired goals. Chess. And one of the things that's very noticeable about chess is that having empathy with the chess pieces does not help you in any way. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Like really, really caring about the interior perspective of the knight is actually going to make you a worse chess player. If you are extremely good at being entirely focused on the objective situation, holding an enormous amount of information in your head about what's going on and being able to very rapidly select the right choice, strategically, you'll be a good chess player. Well, it turns out that in the world that we live, there's a lot of stuff that's like that. There's a lot of stuff where not actually having any meaningful amount of empathy for the pieces that you're moving around, which now it turns out to be people, sometimes known as employees, or members of the political movement that you happen to be leading, and having a very surgical focus on maximally strategically positioning, you might call it the energetic domain. By energetic domain, I mean like like in military terms, finding the weak point on enemy lines and then surging your forces through the enemy lines and then getting behind them. Like that's what I'm talking about. Mm-hmm. Like that's how you win. So if you're talking about military strategy, you're also talking about business strategy. The metaphors flow back and forth very easily. And you're also talking about like disruptive venture strategy. If I want to disrupt the educational system, there's a whole set of characteristics and trainings that make me just better at it than other people in the domain of strategy. And particularly in the domain of strategy around technology, because if I want to do strategy around technology, I need to be able to grasp technology very deeply, which means I need to be able to hold like lots of stuff in my head. So I need to be really smart, like really smart. And I need to have done something developmentally that put a lot of this information in my head, and also not be a scientist, right? Because that's the scientist is like really smart, may understand science and technology. I have to have this other characteristic, which is that I actually have strategy as part of my modus operandi, something that I'm motivated to deploy in the world, that I've actually spent life energy on developing capacity, right? So that's me. Like I just described myself. Like that's, and then by the way, just to add one third piece to it, because as growing up, things like role-playing games and science fiction and comic books were a big part of my developmental environment. The notion that the world is very much made up. You know, we can choose to just make up a different story, and if we can make that story more real than it is, was again part of my developmental environment. Okay, well, only a certain set of characteristics are going to select for people who are going to be successful in any niche that has those as the constraints. Most of them will look like me. Most of them will look like Elon Musk. Our arcs have a lot of similarity to them, including failed marriages. And Silicon Valley is littered with these kinds of kids because Silicon Valley figured out that particular typology fits a particular niche. You know, back in the early days of Silicon Valley, they were like, they were like coming out of World War II and recognizing that there was something about technology that was important and powerful, and trying to figure out like, okay, how do we do this better? With like IBM was the East Coast, archetype. So they come over to the West Coast and they start experimenting with different approaches on how to actually do this technology innovation thing. And they started getting these archetypes where I would use Steve Jobs as an example. He's a little bit late in the curve, but nonetheless a really good example of a particular kind of person who had these skills, these capacities. The capacity to have this vast imaginal space of all the possibilities of what technologies could be combined into to create a particular effect. In his case, he had kind of a design marketing version of it. So he was seeing it from the point of view of something that would be sexy that other people would be interested to get, because as a kid, he had a lot of con man experience and grifter experience. So that was part of his developmental skill set. But Wozniak was his key partner in crime in the beginning there. And Wozniak was coming at it from more of the kind of the systems design and seeing how these things were possible. And Silicon Valley was like, oh, wow, okay, I get it. These kind of really weird, low EQ, like when I'm talking to them, I'm not even getting the facial expressions that indicate that they're a human being sometimes. Kids, they're the ones who are the peak predator in this niche. Okay, cool. I need to optimize for that. I need to get find a way to make them more effective. So how do I put them in constructs that either incentivize them to do things that they don't like to do naturally but have to, like talk to other people, and work with people who have collaborative skill sets, and all this stuff. Like it figured out how to create a construct that super empowered these particular individuals. So that's what I was saying, is that the things that I found myself attracted to, and frankly still attracted to, because if I can earn this weird capacity through all kinds of tragedy and sacrifice on my own part and the people who I care about, and it would be nice to be able to put it to use. So the capacity to see vast complex systems and see how all the pieces fit together, and to notice how subtle shifts in science could be shifted into technologies that could disrupt certain characteristics of the system to shift things in a big way, is attractive to me because I can do it, and it would be nice to believe that it's useful. But in any event, what I do if I go into that space is that I find myself with a whole lot of other folks who are somewhat similarly disabled. And I noticed that particularly over the past decade and a half, unless you're playing the Silicon Valley game straight down the middle, so unless you're like building Uber or Facebook or Snapchat, that particular typology is not actually the right typology for building this next kind of thing. Mm-hmm. It throws too many errors. It can't collaborate anywhere near as well as is necessary to build game B, for example. Mm-hmm. So that's what I was trying to say in that Twitter, pithy set of like nine characters.
Right. Yeah. I could respond to this, or we could pop over to the YouTube page and.
Yeah, I like that. Let's do that. Let's see if there's something going on that feels good.
Okay, cool. Okay, I'm looking at the YouTube chat box now. Let's see.
This is the first live stream I've ever done, actually. I'm just realizing.
Yeah, no, me too.
If I do this, there are people who are perceiving it in real time that I have no idea who they are.
Correct. Yeah, and there's a 20-second delay too.
Oh, well, they're proceeding in 15 seconds from now.
Yeah. So. Okay, I'm just going to read the first comment that I see what happens here. If you consider the different functions of money, unit of exchange, store of value, fungible, etc., it does not need all of these features anymore. We have computers for trust. That's just a little snippet. I sort of chose at random. Is anything interesting in there that you want to appeal?
Okay, yeah, sure. Let's pop that open. So it took me a while to actually process it because a lot of that I've been thinking about for a long time. So I just need to think, okay, what's maybe obvious to me, but is in fact not common knowledge. So the first piece is to recognize that the thing that we call money has a bundle of functions that it tends to bundle together. So it bundles things like unit of account, and it bundles things like medium of exchange and store of value. These are things that in economics is the way they talk about it. I should mention some other ones, by the way, just as long as we're at it, because the key thing of what I'm about to say is we can decouple them. We can unbundle these things and think about them as not necessarily having to be part of the same construct. I should mention, by the way, that at a meta level in terms of ethics, bundling and unbundling is a massive consideration. And the notion, for example, that we bundle, what's one we were talking about? And this is maybe a little bit challenging, but the way that recently in California, getting vaccines and going to school have been bundled is an ethical quandary, because those don't naturally belong together. Like there's no reason for them to be together other than the fact that because people want to go to school, if we bundle vaccines with school, now vaccines is upregulated. But the same thing happens like with cable companies. The old, if you want to get ESPN, you also have to get Disney or whatever. If you want to get internet, you have to pay for TV. Like bundling things creates enormous amounts of ethical quandary because it takes people's choices away. So maybe that's even part of the implication here, is that because money has bundles lots of things together that don't necessarily need to be bundled, it creates an ethical quandary because it takes people's choices away. And maybe we're now at a moment where we could begin to unbundle them in more ethical, which is to say more choice enhancing ways. So the other things that I was going to mention that are bundled are, if you look at the way that we use money in the economy, it does a bunch of different things simultaneously. And this is a big reason why it kind of gets selected for as a convergent attractor. So the price gives me orientation towards where I might orient or spend my time. So if I look at, say, wages as a price signal, that job which will pay me the most money and that I can get, maybe is the thing that I should be doing, right? The most value that I can actually contribute to the economy by hypothesis is that job which will pay me the most money and that I can also get, that I can qualify for. So the price signal helps us orient our time and attention towards those activities that are most valuable. That's really, really important, like super hard. Like at this very moment, what conversation should I be having? I'm talking with you. Is this the right one? Are you and I actually spending our time optimally? What economics would say is that if we had a price signal, if every single choice that we made was guided by a price signal, I could just look out there and have like a bunch of bid-ask markets for my particular podcast time. Whichever bid-ask market had the highest price, by definition, would be the place where I'm giving the most value. Because everybody's paying for the minutes of podcasts, and that's the one that's most important. So that's one piece, right? That's one piece, and it's super powerful because it's simple yet universal. Meaning, whether it's talking on a podcast or making an asparagus, and whether it's me or it's somebody in Zimbabwe, the price signal can kind of flow through all those things. But it also does things like orient. It's actually how we go about allocating resources. So not just how do we personally, like how do I get my choices activated out in the world, is also through money. And so I am oriented towards how I choose to attend my time and energy. What work will I do to give value to the whole? But also, I'm telling the whole what value I want them to give me. And these two things match. So if I've got $10 and I put those $10 on a new iPhone, then the entire economy is like, iPhones are better. We should be doing more of that. Put $10 on orange, then the entire economy shifts to oranges, right? And more importantly, in terms of ethics, if I say I want organic orange as opposed to a pesticide orange, then in principle that signal percolates out, and there's some shift in the whole choice field towards slightly more organic-ish. Obviously, there's a lot of noise in the total attenuated signal. But then it's also incentive. It's not just orientation, it's incentive and motivation. Like, well, okay, the entire value field is telling me that I should be a doctor because that's what would pay me the most money and that I can qualify for. But I don't want to be a doctor. Being a doctor sucks, right? But nope, that's your motivation, your incentive. And here's the trade-off. Do something that you think sucks, that you aren't interested in, make a lot of money, and then you get more choice making to get the things that you want. You see that little loop right there? Mm-hmm. Which of course we're all familiar with that trade-off. I'll go be an investment banker, do really bad things, make a lot of money, and then get whatever I want, which tends to also be, interestingly enough, vapid and not fulfilling. But then we got another one, which is really interesting. At a higher level, we have this hypothesis that the collective allocation of resources that are being created by this bimodal relationship between where I'm orienting my time and attention by the price signal and how I'm getting what I want, creating price signals through demand, puts choice making, coming back to the beginning of the conversation, differentially in the hands of the people who are the best at getting us what we want, entrepreneurs in the middle, right? So if I'm making oranges and you're making oranges, and I either am able to make them cheaper or able to make them, let's say, organic, better, and the market wants oranges, and I'm either making them cheaper or better or some combination thereof, I'm making more money. I'm either getting more demand or my cost basis is lower, so more money is accruing to me. I'm satisfying global need more value is being produced, and therefore I get more choice making. Right. So I remember there's two things that are bundled here. One is my incentive for doing the thing that the market wants, that maybe I may or may not want, is that I have more choice making to further my own interests. This is a separate one. This is because I am now proven to be fucking effective. I should be given more choices because then I can steer our collective resource allocation more effectively. Like I can say, okay, fuck gasoline, I'm gonna make electric cars. I've got a lot of money now, so I can choose to put $100 million of my own money into it and jumpstart this thing. And to some extent, that's true. Right? To some extent, the people who are effective at X, producing oranges, may also be globally effective at other things. But of course, in some sense, it's also not true. Just because you're a really good investment banker doesn't mean you know jack shit about education. And yet you have generic universal choice-making capacity through this token and called money. And if you choose to put your mind towards funding research or funding nonprofits or funding private schools or anything that happens to do in education, your choices begin to go in that direction. So you can kind of like launder investment banking expertise into education expertise without having any of the thing on the right and having plenty of the thing on the left. So that's a lot of words, but it's actually, I think, an important thing to have in your mind, which is money bundles a lot of things together. On the one hand, because it does that, it's extremely capable of producing certain kinds of efficiencies and effects. It's highly competitive against other signaling mechanisms. On the other hand, because it bundles all those things together, you get a lot of stuff that aren't necessarily actually well handled, stuck together. And it's really hard to pull them apart because they're part of this important, powerful system. As our interlocutor noted, we now live in a world where information is super easy. When signal is being sent through face-to-face conversation, the rare teletype, and maybe letters, money is insanely more powerful than any other possible signaling mechanism for propagating information through the social field. When everybody is 24/7, unfortunately, connected with mobile giant computers, we can produce as many signals as we'd like, up to your literally the limits of your attention. So we can imagine a system where we begin to have a very large number of other kinds of signals. The folks at the Metacurrency Project, with I think remarkably poor marketing acumen, call them current Cs, seeing currents, to replace currency, but different kinds of currencies that signal different things differently to more fully actually help us make sense of those values as opposed to all these things that are bundled together. So yes, by the way, challenging. It's not obvious exactly how you do that. And most efforts in that direction have largely, well, Most efforts in the direction of unseating money have largely failed. Let me give you some simple, obvious examples of things of this sort that are sort of obviously successful. Amazon and Yelp ratings. So I'm trying to find out how to most fully satisfy my desire to read a good book or have a good meal, a good cup of coffee. Well, one mechanism I might use is the price signal. I might look for the most expensive book or the most expensive book that I can afford. I look and I say, okay, this book's $30. I've only want to spend 20, go. And that's the price signal trying to help me orient my time and attention efficiently. But of course, that's kind of a shitty signal. It's obviously terrible. So Amazon's signal of ratings and reviews radically increases my capacity to process that information space. And you might notice really shifts the price signal. So if I have a book that's trying to sell itself for $30, and there's another book that's sort of roughly in the same domain, so they're comparable, and one's a 1-star and one's a 5-star, the 1-star is not going to sell at all, 0 demand. And the one that's 5-star is going to sell, take all the demand. So the price signal suddenly gets shifted, and this one either just goes away or the price has to go down. More clearly the case in Yelp. Right? So if I've got 5 coffee shops and one of the coffee shops has 5 stars and each one has like going down, coffee shop with 3 stars, if it's charging exactly the same price, it's going to be getting much less sales. So there's actually a completely different information signaling mechanism, a currency, in this case in the form of a review or a star rating, that is not money and meaningfully changes our capacity to make effective choices in getting our needs fulfilled. And by the way, also has direct, real, measurable implications for the price signal affecting money. So we can be very, very clever about that. We can begin to think about modulating different forms of currencies, including, by the way, different forms of money that have different design characteristics. And then the altcoin universe played with a bunch of different ones, and there's hundreds of millions of other variations, and see what kinds of consequences those have. So that's what I have to say about that.
Another question that I wanted to ask you, someone threw it out in the group, was like if the Silicon Valley personality disposition you described earlier, that is the peak predator in the tech space. What are some of the qualities that you see essential in somebody who has an entrepreneurial mindset, who is also interested in sense making and transitioning into game B? What are some of those qualities that are actually become the peak predator in this new space?
Well, in that case, the metaphor of peak predator feels a little off. And I think that's one characteristic.
Yeah.
That notion of something feels off, like a basic orientation towards these qualities of feeling, this aesthetic discernment, an orientation towards aesthetic discernment, meaning a basal capacity to attend to building skillfulness and using that modality to make choices. That would be a primary characteristic, because this particular modality is increasingly meaningful, increasingly important, for example, in navigating complexity. If you want to navigate complexity using analytical reasoning, you're going to have a very bad day. If you want to navigate complexity using aesthetic discernment, you'll have a much better day. By the way, it's still not going to be an awesome day because complexity is complex, but it's going to be a much better. Here's another one. I called this, and I don't think it really landed, I called it infinitesimal courage. So the story there was something like an inquiry into the nature of courage itself. Like, what is courage? And one of the things that I noticed was that, at least I proposed, like, who knows if this is even vaguely valid, but I proposed that courage was a simple acceptation of the fact that it was discovered in the evolutionary arc that adults, parents, who put themselves at physical first-person risk oftentimes would have, their children would survive, right? So the mama bear protecting her cubs. That instinct to be willing to put yourself at first-person risk, leading to net positive consequences for your genome, becomes an underlying capacity that can be exapted, meaning taken away and put into a different context. Where, okay, well, now I'm not protecting my genome, I'm protecting my tribe. Okay, well, tribes that had courage, more people had courage, radically outcompeted tribes that didn't have courage. So, okay, it becomes even more further embedded, both now, by the way, genetic predisposition multiplied by cultural reinforcement. We're telling lots of stories about heroes who sacrificed themselves for the greater good. But then it can be exapted from my tribe to my nation. There's no French tribe But Napoleon did a great job of creating this meta story, this narrative, this ideology that there's a French nation, and once again exacted courage. So I'm willing to now just charge at a whole bunch of people throwing lead at me really fast in defense of this thing, right? Again, the genetic predisposition of the mama bear protecting her cubs multiplied by culture creates this thing. And courage is very powerful. Right? Those groups that are more fully capable of upregulating courage, mostly in young males, clearly have been more successful over historical time. But what's interesting about it that I was thinking about was it's almost exclusively very narrow band, which is your willingness to subject yourself to meaningful harm and damage from the outside. And you put yourself in front of things that could create physical or mental, emotional harm to you. And you're protecting something with your, more or less, your body. But the interior side tends to be completely not present in courage, right? So for example, I think relatively ubiquitous, or not ubiquitous, but the relatively commonplace story of, say, a truly, truly courageous soldier who kills himself because he's gay. Gay is not well received in the 30s and 40s in the military, and he can't, deal with that in his interior. And he never chooses to, find a way to process it. This is that story, or fill in the blank. It doesn't matter. There's many, many, many things. So what happens is that courage is very outward facing, but we find that actually most of the things that we have to overcome, particularly in this news story, are inward facing. And old school courage doesn't help us at all. In fact, it helps us zero, maybe even minus. It distracts us. We can create an enemy out there that we can, gear up for old school courage to go out and combat, precisely to distract ourselves from actually dealing with the enemy in here. So infinitesimal courage was this particular changing of habits from aversion to curiosity. So something comes up, you have some experience. You experience a, what's it called? Microaggression? Yes, you experience a microaggression and you are micro-triggered. Now you've got, broadly speaking, two possible responses. One would be an aversion response. That is a bad thing. I'm going to avoid it. Either I'll avoid the person, or I will create some kind of protection mechanism, or possibly I'll even just dilute it and repress my own experience. Those are all aversion responses. Or I can have a curiosity response. I can be like, okay, something just happened here. Some signal is happening in my environment. I'm going to be curious. What the hell's going on? And almost be oriented towards it. Not to go into it recklessly, because it might be truly dangerous, but to pay attention, but without a reaction, right? Not to push back or protect or dilute or whatever it happens to be, but actually be like, what's this all about? Actually become more open, more perceptive, slow down, fan open your perceivers and your sense making, break down your ideological presuppositions that project what must be the case already. Oh, this is other. This is just a bad guy. Bad guy just happened. I had a conversation at a coffee shop recently. I actually don't know how old he was. Younger than me, but I don't know how old exactly. And he gave me some really interesting insight into the experience of, I guess, folks who are probably, millennials and Gen Z. I don't know exactly, but people who grew up very much in the digital field, digital natives. Because he was noticing that there was an almost instantaneous outgrouping trigger, that a huge amount of social experience was very quickly endeavoring to sense whether the person you're interacting with is in group or out group. And after he told me that, I started paying attention. I noticed, this actually does seem to be the case. Like you're talking about the pithy things that are going on Twitter. A lot of that seems to be well explained by people protecting themselves and then sending signals out into the world that are designed to identify whether or not the people they're interacting with are in group or out group. And on the one hand, this is really quite challenging. That creates an enormous inability to communicate, because that notion of in group and out group is already, and that just forms micro tribes. You very quickly devolve into a balkanization into micro tribes and non-generative micro tribes. If I identify everything that is signaling negative as out group, then all I have is a very homogeneous in group, and you evaporate pretty quickly. But the inquiry as to why, like how it is you get there, is actually quite interesting. And I think that it speaks to this capacity or this competence in infinitesimal courage, or speaks to the need for it, which is to be able to shift your habit from a habit of reactive reinforcement of what may or may not be an interior that actually serves you more fully, and shift that habit towards curiosity, where you can actually be more, and of course, this is all part of sovereignty. You can be more able to be aware of, more thoughtful about making choices about how you want to respond to this phenomenon, and then choose those that actually do serve you, which may take some time to suss out. So aesthetic discernment and infinitesimal courage were two characteristics that came up. Mm-hmm. Another one was, I've told this one in the language of information theory, in terms of signal and discernment in general, signal upregulation and downregulation. So there's like two movements. One is like right now, as you're listening to me spew nonsense out of my mouth, to what degree are you able to just separate the signal from the noise? Like, if you're rejecting what I'm saying because some of it's noise, then you're wasting everybody's time. If you're rejecting what I'm saying because some of it's noise, and then you actually take the time to write that down on YouTube, you're wasting even more time. But if you're able to say, okay, look, nobody's going to be telling the whole truth. In fact, almost everybody's full of bullshit a lot, because it's hard not to be full of bullshit. I'm going to listen, and I'm just going to throw away the parts that are noise and take the parts that are signal. And that's that. Like, that's just how these relationships work, right? So that's like three levels that I just went through, right? One level is not to be so fully reactive that you actually waste your own time reacting and then expressing your reaction. Not to be reactive, but then to actually just learn that that's just the world we're in. You're in a world where you need to learn how to listen and pull that signal, which is the thing that is nutritive for you, throw away the noise. And then, right, that's the first move. And then the second move is, then how do you bring more signal back into the world? And it may not be in this conversation, right? It may be in this conversation. You hear what I'm saying, you're like, okay, Jordan, like 85% of what you just said is bullshit, but this 15% sounds pretty good. So let's focus on that, and let's upregulate that and get that to like 45%. Can we do that? And here's how I'm going to try to contribute, right? So you're now using your discernment in expression and adding something back into the conversation, which makes the conversation even richer for us and by anybody else who perceives it. Or you might just bring it into, other conversations. It could be anywhere, right? You're bringing that signal back into the world. It doesn't matter exactly where it is, as long as it is an increase in the overall signal in the world. Mm. But I was talking to a woman of, I think, Romanian descent, who now lives in Germany, named Alex S., I think is what she told me to call her, or how to name her. And she was telling me about a ritual that she loved when she was a child. I think it's part of the Orthodox religion, and Easter. And the way that it worked was, I'm just going to tell the story the way I have probably embellished it. So I'm probably not telling you the truth, but I'm telling you a story that landed for me that is largely based upon what she actually told me.
It's okay. I'll toss out the bullshit.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. Perfect. Now we're playing together. So midnight on Easter, the lights are out. It's dark. Candles are lit at churches. People come with candles, unlit candles. They come to the church, they light their candle. They come out of the church, they walk down the street. If you encounter somebody on the street with an unlit candle and you have a lit candle, it is sort of the thing to do to light their candle with your candle. So in the beginning, the source of light is at the church. Very quickly, the overwhelming source of light is just people in your community who are walking through the streets. And if you just, by the way, do the math on this, it's going to be a very steep exponential curve. Right? So for a while, there's only a few people who have walked into churches, lit their candles, who are walking out. But as they encounter somebody with an unlit candle and they light it, the number of lit candles begins to increase. The probability of an unlit candle encountering a lit candle increases, and you get an explosion. And now the whole town is lit by these candles, of relationships of people actually encountering each other. And then you think about the metaphor, because the signal noise metaphor is very similar to the light heat metaphor in thermodynamics. So one thing is to become in yourself. So now I'm using the metaphor, this capacity that we're exploring, is to become a candle, meaning become an object that when exposed to heat can become light, can produce light. And don't be a green stick, right? Where I can put a lot of heat on you and nothing comes out except for maybe acrid smoke. Don't do that. Become a candle where just not too much heat, combustion, light. And by the way, it gives off more heat. So now what happens is become candle is one thing. Then seek the light. As you're walking around, you've become candle and you seek the light, find the light. When you find the light, come close enough to the light that you yourself now become a source of light. When you're a source of light, share that light. As you see other people who are becoming candle, share whatever light you have, which actually means also sharing heat to help them combust. But it's through the signal of light that you're actually able to perceive that relationship. At the end of the day, you don't want to melt their candle. Right? You don't want to like hold your candle near their candle so it just melts. You actually want to turn that heat into light, enlighten them. And if enough people become candles, enough people seek the light, enough people share the light skillfully, then you get an explosion, an exponential explosion that starts slow, but and maybe in certain locations, certain individuals or places where the first candles are lit. But eventually more and more and more of the candles are actually happening from the community. And then it becomes everyone.
Are you just trying to get me to accept Jesus Christ as my Lord and Savior?
If you would decide Orthodox is your thing, then definitely you should do that. It'd be a very weird choice to become a Eastern Orthodox and not accept Jesus Christ. But I imagine there are other metaphors that can be employed.
No, it's beautiful. One other thing that I wanted to ask you is about, oh man, I should have written down the word use. Well, how much time do you have? When do you need
maybe
to go?
10 more minutes.
Okay. 10 more minutes. Okay. Generative collectives. What did you say? Generative something. It was like tribes, generative tribes. One of the things you were saying about social media was people constantly signaling in group versus out group.
Non-generative tribes, actually, is what I said. And so the inverse of that would be a generative tribe.
Yeah. I want to point to the inverse of it. So
okay.
I've been thinking a lot about like what makes up a generative tribe and like wanting to outsource an experiment in creating a tribe that is generative in nature. And I don't know what that looks like yet. I'm just sort of like hovering around that idea. And I wonder if you had any thoughts about
yeah, boy, do I.
It's huge. It's a huge topic, and it's going to depend on like this particular tribe's disposition, what their work is in the world. But just in the spirit of like shining a light in that direction, do you have any ideas of groups that are doing something like this, or maybe just your own thoughts of how you could see that being a potentially valuable exercise? I know that's a fucking huge question.
When you say groups that are doing something like this, what is the this that you're pointing at?
I think it's like tribes that are groups that are experimenting with collective coherence. So maybe maybe it's a startup. Maybe
so groups that are experimenting with generativity.
Yes.
So they're not. So they're at least they're conscious. They're consciously aware of the possibility and maybe importance of what we might call technologies of generativity in what they are doing. And they may be just that may be all they're doing. Like, let's just do that. Or they may be saying, we're going to do X, but while we're doing X, we're also going to be mindful of this. Like, that's what you're talking about?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. So there's an increasingly large number. Mm-hmm. And what's interesting, actually, now that I think about it, is that they seem to come from a number of different qualitative, is that right? Well, different kinds of approaches to addressing that problem. So I'll give you an example. One approach we might think of as being architectural. So I was talking to a guy named Oliver Sauter, I think. He's working on a project called World Brain, of which one piece of it is called Memex. So they're looking at it from the point of view of how do we generate an information architecture, a technical tool, like Wikipedia is a technical tool, that by its nature, the way that it's physically designed, upregulates the generativity of anybody who uses it. So that's one example, by the way. It's very important. It's a very important example. That sounds, like we said, like the media that we use serve our expressive capacity in certain ways and don't serve it in other ways. Well, one of the things we can use is design. We can design or redesign the tools that we use to upregulate our generative capacity. So in this case, what happens is this approach has the advantage of scale. In some sense, everybody on the planet could use this tool. And so everybody on the planet would then be participating in some level in a meta-generative meta-tribe. So that's one approach. As another approach, I actually participated in a project or a gathering. I think that the overall project headline is called Jubilee. And they were using what they were calling a sacred technology from the indigenous peoples of North America called circle practice or circle tucking. It's not Guy Senstock circling. It's more like losing the language. So there's a very specific term. In fact, I know there is. Anyway, a circle of people talking. Mm-hmm. And particular characteristics, exactly how it works and what you do, what your prep is, and what you're called upon. And they were bringing in the inquiry of endeavoring to actually do the work of healing the primordial wound of science, which involves first the inquiry of what is that primordial wound, and maybe just getting to the bottom of it is the healing of it. And what they brought together was a quite diverse group of individuals, one of which was me, as well as individuals who were representing different indigenous groups and different cultures that were participating in this circle in Oakland. And then there will be others in different locations using the same sacred technology and certain crossover participants. And there was a very distinct awareness, both in the circle and then after, on the part of this group, of the sacred technology itself, like the technology, the capacity of saying, okay, we've got like a Western scientist from just straight down the middle in this group, and then we've got a person from an indigenous nation that they have a lot of epistemological and historical and emotional distance between them. How can we actually have a generative conversation? These are actually two very concrete tribes that are quite distinct, and oftentimes don't get along, and oftentimes, in fact, epistemologically can't communicate. And I remember actually a particular story where it was just sort of spoken as obvious that we're all part of the same human family because we all started in Africa. And the indigenous guy's like, I don't know about you, but my people came out of a hole in the ground near the river. You just tried to impose an epistemology on me about the nature of reality that I don't accept. That's not my epistemology, man. So you're like, whoa, okay. So and to try to resolve that gradient was an effort of this particular sacred technology and people participating in it. And so there's a lot of that, like Guy Senstock's work on circling practice is efforts to figure out how to actually generate relationality dynamics that change the way that we're actually able to have kinds of conversations. I'm actually beginning a project with Guy and John Vervaeke and Chris. I don't know exactly how it's going to play out, but the four of us just started having a conversation of being more self-aware, like being more intentional about trying to do exactly that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. At a meta level, what I would say is that there's like a set of basic characteristics that will give you the generativity of a tribe, but of a gathering of human beings. These are like the design constraints, and they're actually constraints. They have tensions. So I mentioned one earlier, like homogeneity versus heterogeneity, or diversity versus sameness. So a fully homogeneous group has a very low generativity. Essentially, they collapse to a single node, a single point. If you and I believe exactly the same things, there is no difference between us. We are the same person. And that's not, then we're not generative. Like our dialogue is not helpful. It's just I might as well be dialoguing with myself. I'm closer to myself. To the degree to which you and I have diverse perspectives, the possibility is larger, and then the generativity is something. But of course, as the diversity increases, then you have the problem of actually communicating. I've got a lot of space we have to traverse. If you speak Klingon and I only speak through a language of light signals, and you're blind, we're gonna have a really hard time communicating. We have a huge diversity of perspective, but the diversity is so large that the actualization of that possibility is essentially zero. Right? So you're actually solving for two different constraints. You need to have enough diversity of perspective that the possibility space is large, but you have to have enough sameness that the actualization of that possibility is real. And those are two constraints you need to have. And then in between those two, now you have your psychotechnologies or your sacred technologies, your sociotechnologies, depending on what you'd like to do, which are precisely about enabling the shifting of that gradient. And so a wide variety of different kinds of psychotechnologies can upregulate the capacity to process different things that get in the way of communication. So if I want to go in the direction of language, Google Translate helps somebody who speaks French speak somebody who speaks English to a greater or lesser extent. A hell of a lot better than not having it at all, right? So that's a socio-technology that allows now me, who speaks English, to have a much larger capacity to actualize the possibility of a conversation with somebody who's only fluent in French. And the possibility between us might be quite large. There's something about language that's real. And this is kind of a neat thing. Circling practice, Senstock stuff, really helps with people when you've got trauma between people, where the relationality is an issue. Just the sheer ability to be in relationship at all is an issue. And it creates a container where we're actually exploring what's going on in our relationship as almost a primary inquiry. And that dramatically increases the possibility of at least knowing what's happening and then maybe being able to address it in an increasingly mature and effective fashion. And then we can actually potentially have generative conversations outside of that. And it may be the only generativity we want and or need is relational, because that may be the thing that we're trying to deal with. And there's lots and lots. I mean, the space is absurdly enormous. But broadly speaking, I'd say there's three primary characteristics. One is sovereignty. So this is your capacity as an individual to more and more and more be able to be in relationship with reality, which includes other people. The second is the set of psychotechnologies that are associated with increasing the capacity to move from the possibility of a conversation into its actuality through the complexity of whatever happens to be the characteristics of the conversation. And then the third is the actual conversations. Who's talking to who? And what's the thing that's bringing people into place? What is the discernment that is allowing people to choose exactly where they're going to put their time and attention in which combination of possible conversations they could be having? I should mention, by the way, you can actually do a 9-dimensional that takes each one of these three and feeds them through the others. So that 9-dimensional is probably a meta construct, but that's probably pushing it too far.
Damn, man, this has been a really great conversation.
I enjoyed it too.
I had no idea where it was going to go, and it went into some really interesting places.
Yeah, it feels like this is a whole bunch of stuff that I don't believe that I've said or talked about outside of more private context. So I'm interested to see if it lands. Like if this felt like a really nice conversation. I quite enjoyed the where we went, even though it seems like maybe we went off script quite a bit.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's neat. I'm intrigued to see what happens. I'm also intrigued to see if anything happened like while it was going on. Like, was there actually a live stream?
Yeah, that's the thing, is like there is a live stream and people have been talking, and I've just been noticing that like this is the first time I've done it. And when I would try and look to see like what was being generated in the chat room, I would lose the thread of what you were talking about. So I felt like I was being pulled. And so I wonder if anyone,
you need a third person.
Yeah, exactly. If anyone in the group has any ideas of what that might look like, and how to have more engagement with the chat room. Maybe there's a third person that like will throw up a question on the screen.
No, you need a third person who's watching the chat room.
Yeah.
And who's basically sitting outside the meta conversation.
Yeah.
And feeling what's happening between us here, but also feeling what's happening there, is able to actually say, okay, here's the thing that's actually getting the most real energy. Let me, like kind of like a director or a conductor with an orchestra. It's almost like directing the flow.
Yes, exactly. Okay, I'll look into that. I want to make this a weekly thing if possible. And just like with different guests and have it helps hold me more accountable with this project.
It's a good tool. Holding yourself accountable publicly will help you lose weight, quit smoking, and make podcasts.
Fuck yeah. Thanks, Jordan.
All right, man.
All right.
Talk to you later.
Bye.
Bye.